I nodded slowly, a dark chill crawling up my spine, completely unaware that stepping through her door tomorrow would seal my eternal damnation. When I returned the following afternoon, the heavy wooden door was already cracked open, as if the shadows inside were expecting me. Zara ushered me into a dimly lit chamber that reeked of burning resin, dried blood, and something sickeningly sweet. At the center of the room sat a smoldering clay brazier surrounded by 7 small ornate glass vials. Behind her, 7 distinct, vibrantly colored banners hung from the rotting walls, each representing a different tribe of the unseen. She did not ask for my name. She simply stared at my hands, her eyes widening as she recognized the cursed lines on my palms. I poured my heart out to her, confessing my Zori blood, the childhood night terrors, and my desperate hunger to see the veil torn open again. I demanded that she act as my bridge, to use her dark arts to summon the entities that had abandoned me. Zara recoiled as if physically struck, her weary face draining of all color as she furiously shook her head. She told me I was utterly insane, a foolish lamb begging to be thrown back into a den of starving wolves. The entities that had stalked my childhood were not guides, they were ancient, malicious executioners waiting for permission to strike. She explained that God had miraculously shielded me, forcing the demons to retreat. And now I was blindly demanding to undo that divine protection. I refused to listen, my arrogance blinding me to the raw, unfiltered terror vibrating in her voice. I argued with her for 2 grueling hours, insisting that my innate power would protect me. But she remained unyielding. In a voice that sounded far too deep to be her own, she banished me from her home, terrified that my blood would stain her hands. But the dark obsession rotting my mind would not allow me to accept defeat, no matter how dire the warnings. I returned to her decaying doorstep the next day, and the day after that, wearing down her resistance with sheer, relentless madness. On my 4th visit, Zara finally collapsed under the weight of my persistence, weeping silently as she surrendered to my doom. She warned me that the door I was forcing open would first invite the most violent monarchs of the abyss, the Crimson Lord and the Saffron Queen. These were not mere spirits. They were towering, malevolent sovereigns who had been hunting my Zori bloodline since my very first breath. With trembling hands, Zara ignited the brazier and began a sickening, forbidden ritual that defied all laws of sanity. She chanted in a forgotten, guttural tongue, crushing the 7 glass vials in her bare hands, letting her own blood mix with the strange perfumes. The air in the room grew suffocatingly dense, vibrating with an unseen, terrifying energy that made my teeth ache. When the incantation ceased, she handed me a small, tightly bound pouch of foul-smelling incense, her eyes avoiding mine. Her instructions were chillingly precise. I was to enter a specific, forgotten cemetery exactly at the stroke of midnight. I had to find a narrow patch of dirt between 2 ancient, unmarked graves and ignite a fire to burn the cursed offering. Afterward, I was commanded to seek refuge in an abandoned mausoleum, light a single green candle, and sleep amidst the dead. Any rational human would have fled from that house, but I clutched the pouch like a prized treasure, my heart racing with dark anticipation. That night, under a starless, oppressive sky, I breached the rusted iron gates of a cemetery situated far beyond the city limits. The silence of the graveyard was unnatural, heavy with the suffocating feeling of 1,000 unseen eyes tracking my every movement. I located the exact spot Zara had described, a sunken patch of barren earth tightly wedged between two crumbling tombstones. My hands trembled violently as I struck a match, igniting a small blaze that cast long, grotesque shadows against the marble slabs. The moment I tossed the foul incense into the flames, the temperature plummeted and the air filled with a deafening sound of phantom whispers. It felt as though an invisible, breathless crowd had suddenly encircled me, waiting in predatory silence for the ritual to conclude. Ignoring the screaming alarms in my head, I inhaled the noxious smoke, sealing the horrific pact I had so arrogantly demanded. I left the graves behind and stumbled blindly through the dark until I found the ruins of an ancient, forgotten saint's shrine. I struck another match, lighting the single green candle and the sandalwood stick, their dim glow barely piercing the absolute pitch blackness. I lay down on the freezing stone floor, pulling a thin sleeping bag over my shivering body, waiting for the veil to finally tear. What happened next remains a fractured, nightmarish blur, a violent rip in the fabric of my reality that I can never fully articulate. I suddenly found my consciousness tethered to the cold stone wall. My physical body was completely paralyzed, yet my eyes were wide open. A deafening, chaotic static filled the shrine, a maddening frequency that seemed to bleed directly from the ancient masonry itself. Out of the thin, freezing air, 7 towering figures materialized, marching solemnly through the locked wooden doors of the mausoleum. They wore deeply hooded, vibrant robes, emerald, crimson, azure, obsidian, saffron, umber, and violet, each crowned with an ornate, shadowy diadem. They formed a tight crescent around my paralyzed form, speaking in a thunderous, overlapping language that I could feel rather than hear. Suddenly, they snapped their heads toward me in perfect, terrifying unison, their faces concealed by an impenetrable, swirling void. Beneath their hoods, I saw only their eyes, massive, perfectly round, and impossibly black, radiating a malice so ancient it stopped my heart. The sheer force of their collective gaze violently ripped my astral form from my flesh, plunging me into a dizzying, terrifying vortex. When my vision cleared, I was no longer in the crumbling shrine, but standing in the center of an ancient, otherworldly bazaar.
The architecture was profoundly wrong, resembling historical Moroccan fortresses, yet twisting at impossible angles beneath a sickly, bleeding sky. I was completely trapped in a dimension of pure nightmare, surrounded by towering, shadowy entities that watched me with predatory amusement. The 7 crowned monarchs appeared once more, their towering silhouettes dominating the terrifying landscape of the demonic market. A voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere, stating that I had foolishly summoned them, but now I had to survive their horrific tests. The entity draped in the white shroud raised a jagged, bone-white staff and brought it crashing down against the spectral earth. The impact shattered the fabric of the nightmare, sending a shockwave of pure, unfiltered agony directly into my human soul. I jolted violently awake on the freezing floor of the shrine, my entire body screaming in unimaginable, bone-crushing pain. My limbs felt as heavy as lead, my mind completely fractured, and a terrifying realization settled like an anchor in my gut. I had successfully forced the door open, but I had not become their master. I had willingly offered myself as their eternal prey. That cursed night marked the beginning of my absolute destruction, plunging me into an abyss of suffering that no human should endure. The shadows in my home began to move on their own, morphing into grotesque, feral beasts that watched me from the corners of the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I was violently dragged back into those demonic realms, subjected to psychological tortures that defy mortal description. A profound, suffocating darkness took root in my chest, completely altering my personality and severing me from the light of humanity. I no longer recognized the hollow, decaying reflections staring back at me in the mirror. The Elias I knew was dead. Paranoia became my only companion. I spent entire weeks locked in a pitch-black room, convinced that every stranger in the street was a demon in disguise. The relentless psychological torment inevitably gave birth to a devastating, crushing depression that stripped away all meaning from my existence. I lost the ability to distinguish between day and night, reality and hallucination, my mind reduced to a shattered, bleeding labyrinth. The demonic whispers grew deafening, constantly urging me to end my own life, to surrender my Zuri blood to the waiting earth. Over the span of a horrifying blur, I attempted to violently end my own existence 4 separate times, desperate for the absolute silence of the grave. Each time, by some incomprehensible divine intervention, my family found me just seconds before the veil of death could claim me. They dragged me through endless hospital corridors, desperately seeking answers from psychiatrists who diagnosed me with severe bipolar disorder. My body became a toxic laboratory for heavy sedatives and antipsychotics, yet absolutely none of the chemical chains could bind the demons inside my head. The doctors were utterly baffled by my resistance to the medication, unaware that my sickness was not of the brain, but a siege on my soul. My family, refusing to believe in the supernatural, helplessly watched me wither away into a catatonic, hollow shell. In a final, desperate bid to spark life back into my dead eyes, they organized a family trip to a coastal city, hoping the ocean breeze would heal me. I walked among them like a reanimated corpse, completely dead to the vibrant world around me, until a strange, invisible force gripped my chest. One evening, while sitting silently in a bustling seaside cafe, an overwhelming compulsion hijacked my limbs, forcing me to stand. I left my family behind, walking aimlessly through the crowded summer streets, entirely controlled by a magnetic, supernatural pull. My wandering feet led me away from the noise, dragging me toward an isolated ancient mausoleum perched at the edge of the crashing waves. As I stood before the weathered wooden doors, the suffocating fog of depression that had choked me for years began to miraculously lift. A profound clarity washed over my fractured mind, and I stepped into the dimly lit sanctuary, finding it completely empty save for an old man seated by the inner archway. The elder looked up, his eyes radiating an unnatural, blinding warmth, and he smiled, as if he had been waiting for me for centuries. He gestured for me to sit beside him, and the moment I did, a devastating realization hit me with the force of a collapsing building. I suddenly comprehended the sheer magnitude of the demonic siege I had endured, the dark rituals, the unseen stalkers, the agonizing madness. I broke down completely, weeping violently on the cold floor, unable to contain the ocean of grief and trauma I had carried in silence. The old man placed a comforting hand on my trembling shoulder, his voice echoing with a divine authority that commanded the shadows to flee. He revealed the staggering truth. The ancient kings of the abyss had thrown their deadliest curses at me, expecting me to die within a single day. Yet my Zuri blood was so profoundly radiant that I had unwittingly fought off an army of demons, surviving their lethal onslaught. Then the elder uttered a sentence that shattered my perception of time entirely, stating that I had been fighting this invisible war for 4 agonizing years. I stared at my hands in sheer, absolute horror. 4 entire years of my life had been erased, stolen by the darkness in the blink of an eye. It was as if I had been trapped in a deep, catatonic coma, a wandering madman completely detached from the flow of human time. The elder warned me that the journey of Azuri is paved with madness and death, but those who cling to the divine light are ultimately shielded. He commanded me to arise, wash away the impurities of my grief, and pray to the heavens, for the demonic chains had finally been broken. I rushed out to the courtyard, performing the ablution with trembling, tear-soaked hands, and entered the adjacent mosque to pray. With every prostration, I felt massive, crushing boulders of dark magic dissolving from my shoulders, my spirit taking its first breath in half a decade. When I finished my prayers, I hurried back to the shrine to thank my mysterious savior, but the sanctuary was plunged in total darkness. The old man had vanished without a trace, and a heavy, rusted padlock now secured the heavy wooden doors. I frantically approached a local passerby, asking where the guardian of the shrine had gone, my heart pounding in my chest. The stranger looked at me with deep confusion, stating that the mausoleum had been permanently sealed and abandoned for over 5 years. A chill swept through my soul, but for the first time in 4 stolen years, a genuine, uncontrollable laugh escaped my lips. I had survived the darkest pits of the unseen world, shielded by a divine mystery I could not yet understand. But as I walked away from the locked doors, I knew with terrifying certainty that the war for my soul had only just begun.